Wisconsin Eye is at the Green Bay Public Library. We're interviewing candidates in the special election in Senate District Number 1. Caleb Frostman of Sturgeon Bay is the Democratic candidate. The general election is June 12th. Caleb, welcome to Wisconsin Eye.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
As a first-time candidate, give us the short version of who you are and your qualifications.
Sure. First, quick 30 minutes. No, I'm kidding. So I have had pretty successful experience in the private sector, worked in banking for 9 years, started as a junior-most analyst, ended up being a vice president of relationship management and lending, and then I've also been very involved in my community, something as small as being on a couple of boards here and there to being a big brother for 5.5 years to the same little, which was, I think, as meaningful of an experience for me as it was for my little. And then I've been in the trenches the last 2 years working in economic development up in Sturgeon Bay for the entire county of Door, working on workforce development initiatives with our youth, as well as focusing on getting small businesses started and helping existing businesses grow.
What's been your biggest win in 2 years as an economic development official?
You know, I think we've had a couple events. Our biggest focus has been on doing a better job of connecting our youth to our employers, kind of deepening that relationship. And so we've done that in a couple different ways. We resurrected a high school home build project that we're really proud of, able to incorporate 11 students from 4 different school districts to build a single-family home from the ground up. And then in the fall of last year, we've been thinking about this for a long time, but finally got it off the ground, was a manufacturing days. So introduced 250 high school students to 9 manufacturers in Sturgeon Bay on a Friday, and then the following day opened it up to the public and had about 400 members of the public come visit those same businesses. A lot of family members that wanted to see what mom or dad or their spouse did, but also folks, the general public, that were just genuinely interested in what these businesses did. So it's great.
So you've been doing economic development in Sturgeon Bay and the Door area.
Yep.
Now you're running in the much broader
Yep.
area, Senate District Number 1. What have
Yep.
you learned about Senate District 1 now that you've been campaigning?
Yeah, it's very diverse. So we've been, knocking doors and making phone calls all over the entire district. So you've got a lot of obviously agriculture in Kewaunee County, very tourism-based in Door County, diverse, but a lot of tourism up there. And then you get down in more of the commercial nodes like De Pere, and we have a bump out into Appleton. So I've been pleasantly surprised at the diversity of the district in terms of its commercial interests and its industries, and so that's been really eye-opening, and it's been a good experience.
On your campaign website, you dream a big dream. I am really stunned by this one sentence. I'll cut middle-class taxes, fully fund education, reduce our debt, and create more jobs by making the rich pay their fair share. If you're elected to the Senate, you don't even know if your party's going to be in control. How can you promise voters in the district this?
Well, that's a great question. I think that's what we've been hearing from folks throughout the district, and we've been sharing it at all of our stump stops and those kind of things. Is I think that middle class folks have been asked to do more with less for far too long, and the term shared sacrifice shouldn't just apply to the bottom 98% of income earners. And so when folks are asked to pay their fair share, we can make investments in K-12 education, we can make investments in healthcare, we can make investments in our roads, which are crumbling, and those type of investments pay dividends for years and in some cases decades. So it's a matter of reallocating our investment strategy away from tax breaks for the wealthy, which no one's seen a return on that other than the wealthy for the last 45 years, so I don't anticipate that changing anytime soon. So when we have more investment dollars on the table, we can be more strategic about where we put those dollars.
Who isn't paying their fair share now? Is it corporations, or is it people with AGIs above what?
A little bit of both. I mean, you look at the preferential tax treatment, I think there's an idea that the investment in those, in either wealthy folks and or corporations, will somehow trickle down to the rest of us, and I don't think that's a sound investment strategy. There really is a bigger payback in terms of job creation and creating demand when the vast swath of the population has the wherewithal to buy necessities like homes and vehicles and invest in their health care and their retirement. That is where the return on investment is, and the virtuous cycle of spending continues. Folks that already have a home and a vehicle or 2 or 3 are unlikely to make those kind of purchases. They've become well off by being prudent and investing wisely. They're unlikely to make frivolous luxury purchases that will somehow trickle down to the rest of us. So I believe in investing in regular folks, working class folks, middle class folks that need to buy and invest in things they've held off on for a long time, whether it's their home, their vehicle. It's really sad to say in 2018, but their health care. Folks that have been doing more with less for a long, long time.
And how do you cut middle class taxes? Do you do the income tax? Do you do the property tax? what do you think would be the most effective vehicle to achieve your goal?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's a combination of all those things. We want to make sure that there's tax fairness and tax equity among making sure everyone's paying their fair share. But I look at the state income tax, and I look at property tax as well. We've got things like the dark store, which I think we'll talk about later. But that shifts an unfair burden onto homeowners, onto commercial property owners, regular Main Street businesses that are paying their fair share. I don't understand why big box retailers can't pay theirs. So it's a combination of all those things, and again, generally speaking, a wiser investment in a broader amount of people that'll have a bigger impact on all of society.
You'd raise the income taxes on those with adjusted gross incomes above what?
I don't have a specific number, but I think we look at somewhere, I don't know, ballparking at $500,000, $1 million. I think there are folks that in today's society, middle class could still be a low six-figure number, but in terms of the highest impact, would think in the $500,000 to $1 million range somewhere in there.
When you say fully fund schools, are you talking about K-12, giving more money to K-12? Are you getting into the 7-year legacy of Act 10? Talk to me about fully fund schools.
So I look at, in 2016 alone, there were local referendums of $1.35 billion for K-12 schools in Wisconsin, which...
That's statewide? That's
statewide, yep.
That's not District 1?
Not District 1, nope, statewide. So look at numbers like that where folks have to pass referendums to get the type of adequate funding they need. And then, our UW system and our higher education system, that's been cut by $1 billion over the last 7 years, about 80% in the UW, 20% in technical colleges. Look at those kind of cuts, it's really hard to recover from those, and the folks that are investing their tuition dollars want to make sure that they get the best return possible. And even if tuition stays the same, if the quality of education is not what it was 7 years ago, or if it's taking you longer because certain sections have been cut, teachers have been laid off, you're likely going to pay the same amount in student loans if you're taking them out to pay for living expenses and other courses that you had to take in maybe a 5-year education versus a 4-year education.
When you talk about student loans, do you think the state should pass a law that would let students refinance student debt?
Absolutely. I don't understand how that's still an issue. I don't, if we can refinance your mortgage, if folks are paying 5, 6, 7% on sometimes up to 6 figures in student debt, I have a hard time fathoming why that should not be able to be refinanced. I would imagine that there would be financiers that would look at the credit scores and be willing to take on that risk, even at perhaps lower interest rates. So it seems like it would be a common sense solution for both borrowers and potential lenders in that field.
The governor and GOP lawmakers said that the Foxconn incentives could potentially be worth 10,000, 13,000 jobs. How would you have voted on that incentive package as a senator?
Yeah, I think it was an extremely large package. There are small businesses, thousands of small businesses in Wisconsin that have started with no subsidies, with blood, sweat, and tears in the garage, in the basement, sacrificed early mornings and late nights, missed kids' soccer games without the level of subsidy that Foxconn got. And these are local entrepreneurs that didn't get a $230,000, or if you look at, if it is $4.5 billion, a $350,000 subsidy per job, and not to mention the environmental relaxation of regulations, drawing 7 million gallons of water out of Lake Michigan a day. I would have voted against the Foxconn package.
You would have voted against it both on environmental and too big of a handout reasons?
Both, yeah.
But here's my question. Don't you think any businesses in the 1st Senate District would benefit potentially from the Foxconn deal?
They would. I mean, I think there's a supply chain set up there that in my role as the DC EDC Executive Director, connected our businesses. If that does move forward, there are folks along the lakeshore that could potentially get in that supply chain. So it's not, that we wouldn't want our businesses to perhaps do business with those folks. It's the level of investment that's concerning, and it's the relaxation of regulations that other folks have not had the benefit of. If other folks follow the rules, have paid their fair share, have done it, like I said, in their basement, their garage, the sweat of their brow, they don't get a $350,000 subsidy like a Taiwanese company that got here in the U.S.
The governor recommended Foxconn-like incentives also for Kimberly-Clark when they announced 600 potential layoffs. It didn't pass, but had it come to the Senate floor, how would you have voted on that?
That's a great question. Again, kind of on a case-by-case basis, looking at the return, the payoff on the investment, the potential return. I'm trying to think if I what would have happened there. But I haven't dug in deep enough on the Kimberly-Clark to know how I would have voted on that one.
Okay, you mentioned the Darkstar controversy. What's your position on that? Is that a problem that needs to be fixed?
It is, and so for what it's worth, I was a real estate major down at Madison before it was called the Grass Camp Center, but everything but in name was the Grass Camp Center. And so one of my favorite classes, probably because I had a great instructor, and Sharon McCabe, was appraisal, and we look at all the different approaches to valuing real estate, including the cost approach, which is what would it cost to replace that building new and then take up the depreciation, which is kind of the least viable of approaches. You look at sales comparable, which is you look at similar type properties, what do they sell for on a per square foot basis, and then adjust them and so forth. But the most viable in commercial applications is the income approach, which is the lease income minus expenses, which gives you your NOI, and then you divide that by what's called a cap rate, which is kind of the expected rate of return. And so nowhere in any of these appraisal approaches is there a caveat for big boxes where you can say the income approach is X, but because other big boxes have gotten this passed, we're going to value you like you're an empty store. And so I cannot reconcile that methodology, and it does shift a huge burden onto homeowners, onto Main Street businesses that pay their fair share like an ongoing concern, and so it's a huge issue for Wisconsin taxpayers.
Tourists and Packer fans need highways 41 and 43. Mm-hmm. But there's a funding impasse in the Capitol over how to pay for future highway needs.
Yep.
If you could wave a wand, how would you fix it?
That's a great question. I want all options to be on the table. I don't think that the ideologues in Madison that refuse to, quote unquote, raise fees or raise taxes. In the meanwhile, in 2018, we're driving on gravel roads, and some of the businesses in our industrial park, at least in Sturgeon Bay, would say that their first chance to make a defective product is when it leaves the store and gets on the highway because it's so bumpy, and they've had many products returned. So all options need to be on the table, whether that's an increase in the gas tax, an increase in vehicle registration taxes. They all need to be on the table to pay for what I consider to be a really strong, wise investment. I've seen firsthand what a new 4-lane highway did up in Door County in terms of what it's done for our industry, what it's done for our agriculture, and for our tourism. That's an investment that can be replicated. The dividends continue to pile up for us.
Some leaders in Madison are interested in tolling. What's your position on tolling?
So it's not a very attractive option. I think of tolling, I think of those gritty little buckets on the side of the road where you throw your change. I've been in other states where they have the electronic version that they read on your vehicle with the little box that's in your car. That's a much more attractive option than the buckets of change. Again, I think all options need to be on the table as to how we fund our roads going forward, and tolling is one of those potential options.
We're in the middle of a national debate, a very emotional debate, school safety and gun laws. Does Wisconsin have tough enough gun laws?
I think we've been very clear that we are strong supporters of universal background checks. If someone's too dangerous to fly on a plane, they're too dangerous to own a gun. If they've threatened a spouse or beaten a partner, they're too dangerous to own a gun. And so the idea of arming teachers seems it seems very nonsensical to me. There are measures that we can put in place. 97% of people want universal background checks. Why they can't get done, I don't understand, similar to bump stocks. So we've, even being a hunter and a proud gun owner, I think there are some common sense measures that will make a huge difference. And even if it saved, one life, it would be worth it. And, universal background checks is a great place to start.
We don't need to act like Florida and raise the age to buy a gun?
That's not been something that we've considered. It's, I think, I'm not sure I have to check the laws. I know for a long time handguns were 21. I think they might still be 21. But long guns have been 18 for a long time. That's something to dig in a little further.
When you talk about funding our K-12 system, what's your position on the growing choice and voucher program?
Yeah, so it's concerning to me that the voucher programs, kind of K through 8, receive about 50% more per pupil than public schools, and same with 9 through 12 are about 60% more per pupil, which is concerning to me because public schools are a huge piece of a community and that community's identity. I know going to public schools here in Green Bay, just up the road at Aldo Leopold, and then a couple blocks over at East, that's a part of the community. It's part of your identity. You grew up there. The businesses know it. The families know it. And so I just believe really heavily in investing in our public schools, not only from the education standpoint, but from the community standpoint and what it does for a community's fabric.
Freeze the choice program or dial it back. But it went from Milwaukee to Racine to now statewide. You would push for what?
I would probably push for pushing it back.
Pushing it back. We've had let's go back to the UW system. We've had a freeze on tuition for resident undergrads for 6 years. Should it go forward, a freeze to 7th and 8th years?
I think the idea of making college affordable is really attractive. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think if you're going to cut $1 billion from that budget, $800 million from the UW budget over the course of 7 years, the quality of that education may not be what it once was. And then, just as big a picture for me is, as those schools cut their budgets, we mentioned if they've cut 3 of the 4 English sessions or sections, then you have to take it a next semester, and all of a sudden you're doing 5 years of schooling, and then again you come into the student debt piece of students. Graduating, the average Wisconsinite graduates with $30,000 in debt. If with a 10-year repayment at, let's say, 6%, it's roughly $300. That's an extra car payment that might prevent somebody from building the wealth that maybe our parents did in terms of renting versus owning a home. And so there are really big questions that need to be answered in terms of what our young folks are able to do in terms of building wealth.
The UW Regents and Assistant President Ray Cross have approved merging the 13 two-year colleges, making them part of the 4 years. Do you support that transition?
I don't know enough about it to support it or oppose it at this point.
On your campaign website, you say 60% of area wetlands, wells, excuse me,
Yep.
that's important. Wells are contaminated.
Yep.
Is that just in Kewaunee County, or is
That's just in Kewaunee County. So actually, we were just at, so that's been known for a while, but I was just at a water quality seminar on Saturday where they reiterated those statistics. So 60% of wells in Kewaunee County have fecal contamination, both bovine and human. And our focus on this is not to place blame, but to continue to move forward with progress. And about a third of residential wells in Kewaunee have unacceptable levels of contamination. And so I think there's been some progress made. Farmers and legislators and environmental groups have come together to make some progress on NR 151 in terms of where manure can be spread, when it can be spread, how close to residential wells, but there's still improvement to be made, and we'll keep our eyes close on that. Because in 2018 in America and in Wisconsin in the 1st District, you shouldn't have to worry about taking a shower in bovine-infested waters or whether you can drink your tap water. That's a really sad state of affairs, so we're focusing on it.
Has that problem hit bottom yet, or is it going to get worse?
That's a great question. I'm not a geologist. I think the most recent restrictions will be helpful. It's been a long-standing problem. It was funny that the presentation was great, and they read some headlines, and the room oohed and ahed when they revealed a little piece of paper. It's like 1955. So this karst geography has been in existence since we've been here. It's shallow soils above fractured bedrock, so there's very little filtration, and then the fracturing within the rock allows the contaminated water to get into the aquifer much, much faster. So it's not a new problem, but I do think there's progress being made, and people understand the gravity of such levels of contamination.
Do we need to cut down on the number of CAFOs?
That's a great question. I think we have adequate number of CAFOs. I think there are folks that are growing and hoping to get even larger. We are really strong supporters of family farms. I was in agriculture fraternity in college. All my friends, all the weddings I've been to have been from fellow dairy farmers and folks that make a living doing this day in and day out. So we have to do everything we can to protect that. I know since 2010 or 2011, more than 3,000 dairy farms have closed in Wisconsin, which is more than 40 a month, which is pretty terrifying, especially if that's your identity and your family's lifeblood and your living. That's a real problem, and so we're focusing on that too.
Does the current DNR protect Wisconsin's environment, Caleb?
I think they try. I'm concerned when the head of the DNR, who I don't know well, but when that position is a political appointee, that's concerning. And then as they play such a strong role in commercial development, and I agree with the sentiment of making Wisconsin open for business, but there are certain resources that are irreplaceable and are extremely expensive to remediate. We've seen what has happened with the Fox River here. It's a great success story, but it's been 20 years in the making, and I don't want to guess the number and get politi-checked, but tens of millions of dollars in remediation efforts here. So there are things that just can't be recovered. We need to understand that those resources are worth protecting and worth investing in going forward.
You make a priority on your campaign website about health care. What are the next set of choices that we face in the issue of health care, and how would you navigate them?
Yeah, so great question. And I've been really passionate about this and vocal that I believe health care is a right. I don't think that anyone should be financially ruined or go bankrupt due to their desire to stay alive or to stay healthy. And so we look at, again, keeping all options on the table. We think we should be expanding Medicaid. We're the only state in the upper Midwest that hasn't done so. And whether it's eventually a single-payer solution, whatever the answer is, folks should be able to access affordable health care. I had some friends that are in their early 60s, successful, own their own business, do just fine financially, but when they went to purchase insurance in the private market this last year, it was going to cost them $46,000, which is mind-blowing. No matter how much money you make, that's a lot of money. And even for a relatively healthy, non-smoking 33-year-old, my premiums are north of $600 a month, which is not easy to come up with. So
Is the ultimate answer a universal health care system?
I think it is. I think that's a priority that society should take care of our people. That's an innate desire to stay alive and stay healthy, and there shouldn't be health insurance executives getting $90 million bonuses based on the premise that people should be profited off of while they're trying to stay alive and stay healthy.
Since 1977, Senate District 77, Senate District 1, thank you for the correction.
Yeah, no problem.
Has been represented by Republicans. What have they got wrong over that long tenure?
Yeah, so I wasn't as familiar with Alan, let's say. I've understood that he was a fairly responsive legislator, different politically than me, but I think was a fairly popular guy. And then Frank, I think well known, didn't live in the district, has been referred to as an absentee senator. So obviously I live in the district, I will live in the district, I'm not going anywhere. So having adequate representation physically being in the district, and then also representing the interests of the constituents. I mean, there are folks that emails have gone unanswered, questions have gone unanswered, and it's where is our senator for months at a time. And so I plan on being as responsive as I have been in my role at DCEDC, and be responsive to my constituents and bring their concerns down to Madison. So I think responsiveness over the last 7 years has lacked horribly, and also keeping the interests of the residents, not just commercial interests.
One of your Republican challengers, Representative Jock, has been there he's in his 4th term.
Yep.
What priorities has he championed? What votes has he cast that you disagree with?
His stance on women's health issues are really problematic. I think that I'm a strong believer in teaching in reality and making sure that people have access to adequate reproductive health, birth control, those kind of things. So that's a huge sticking point for us. His stances on those, and some environmental rollbacks, kind of putting corporations first, has been problematic for us as well. So that's an issue for us.
What about your differences with the other GOP candidate, Alex Barnard?
I don't know Alex well. I think that I've had to interview for every job I've ever had, with the exception of my first job in high school pouring concrete for the family business. But I've had to interview against other candidates. I wasn't born into wealth. I've been active in the private sector, been really integrated in all the communities I've lived in. Like I mentioned, whether it's been being on boards, leading fundraising drives, or being a one-on-one mentor. I've been really active in all the communities I've lived in, so I feel pretty strong about the private sector experience and my community involvement with the folks around me.
Mr. Barnard says if he's elected, because we're in this interim period where they're not in session, he wouldn't take any salary or per diems. Would you?
That's a good question. So I would love to be in a position like Mr. Barnard, where I could not rely on a salary to make a living. But there's work to be done between now and January. There's constituent services, there's likely committee work, there are those kind of things. So there will be plenty of work to be done, and I anticipate doing it between now and January.
If you're elected on June 12th and then win a full term in November, you would consider yourself a successful senator at the end of the full term if, finish that sentence.
Great question. If unemployment remains relatively low, but I look, folks focus on that particular metric, and that's historically been one to focus on, but I am running specifically to improve the quality of life of people around me. And so I believe firmly that if you sign the societal contract, if you sign the contract of working 40 hours a week, that you are entitled to a dignified life, then that means a roof over your head, food on your table, access to affordable health care, and a few bucks set aside for retirement. So the metrics I'd look at would be median household income, along with unemployment, our natural resources being better than when we left them or when we found them on day one. And those are some of the metrics I think we'd look at to make sure that we've done a good job in our 4+ years.
Would you try to reverse both tenets of Act 10, the elimination of collective bargaining and making state employees pay more for health care and pensions? That's
a great question. I'm a strong believer in collective bargaining. I think that people need a collective voice in order to advocate best for themselves. So many times you see the degradation of wages, and you've seen, the kind of the I don't know what the right word I'm looking for here is, but the difference between increases in productivity, whereas wages have remained relatively flat, and a big source of that has been the decimation of unions, and folks haven't been able to advocate for themselves as a group with collective bargaining. So I'm a strong believer in collective bargaining. And then that piece on the healthcare in terms of paying more, that is what I talked about, what has driven me so nuts, and one of the reasons that I've decided to run is this idea that shared sacrifice is a really catchy phrase, but it really only seems to apply to teachers and to laborers and to state union employees, that we can, get some resentment built up towards Madison and towards these, freeloaders, when, in fact, maybe we should be lobbying to make sure that other folks get those same type of benefits, because they're fantastic health care, it's fantastic pension. Instead of being resentful and trying to take away from folks, let's advocate for the larger group and make sure that more people have access to those kind of benefits, because they're really good.
The minimum wage in Wisconsin should be?
Eventually 15. $7.25 is ridiculous. I've run the numbers. That's roughly $14,000 or $15,000 a year. And if you try to, again, have that dignified life of a roof over your head and food on your table at $14,000 a year, it's nearly impossible. I don't know how you would do it without heavily subsidized housing and heavily subsidized food. So $15 an hour is a good start. I think, it would probably take working towards that with a few steps in between. But I think $15 an hour is a fair wage, whatever you're willing to do for 40 hours a week, in order to give you a dignified life.
We've touched on a lot of issues. So I guess my final question, is there any one issue that you consider central to your campaign that you want to highlight now?
Yeah, I think that we've mentioned a couple times, but the tax fairness piece, the middle and working class folks being asked to do more with less, that's a huge tenet of our campaign, to make sure that the little guys being watched out for. And then, within the district specifically, that groundwater issue is really troubling, and it's going to be a big focus for us, again, not to place blame, but to work together with fellow legislators, with agriculture, with environmentalists, to make sure that those regulations, the new ones that are going to be put in place hopefully at the end of this year, are working, and if they're not, to refine them and enhance them a bit.
And just to follow up on that, your mission statement, I'm going to call it that, says reduce our debt. Are you talking about state debt, local debt? Can you be more specific?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, for an example, local governments have been tasked with levy limits and those kind of things, and they've not been able to raise the levy without new construction in order to pay for projects, but they're able to use debt to do those type of things. So we're not able to levy from our existing property base, but the banks are able to get a share through interest and those kind of things. So there are areas where if folks were paying their fair share, we would be able to use the equivalent of cash versus a credit card to pay for the things that we need. And I think that there is some agreement on the things we need. There is not great agreement on how we pay for them. And so tax equity and tax fairness, making sure that everyone pays their fair share and plays by the rules, is a way to make sure that those people in the middle and working classes continue to get their return on their investment.
Thank you. Caleb Frostman of Sturgeon Bay is a Democratic candidate in the special election in State Senate District 1. The general election is June 12. Caleb, thank you for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You bet.